Alright, so this video is going to talk about the stage mode, which of course is where you actually create and set up your scenes. So stage mode is broken up into a couple different panels. We have the main toolbar up at the top. We have the library and visuals tab, which is where you can drag in objects that you imported, as well as change the look of your scene. This will get its own video in the future. We have the create menu, which is how we can add objects that are included with SceneForge. We have the import menu for importing materials and models. The options over here are for the way you manipulate objects in your scene, as you'll see in a minute. And then on the right, we have the properties and hierarchy panel. The hierarchy is basically a list of all the objects in your scene, which is really useful for kind of seeing where everything is if you have a highly populated scene. You can show and hide different objects, as well as select them by clicking on them over here. Now the properties panel will show different options depending on what type of object is selected. So to select objects, all you have to do is move your mouse over them and click. So you see these two objects have different options because they're two different types of objects. All objects, however, have these transform values at the top. And these values basically show the position, rotation, and scale of the object. You can also rename the object up at the top or lock it so it can't be selected again. There's also timeline animation, which we'll get to in a future video. The timeline down at the bottom is how you can actually animate different parts of your scene, but again, that's going to be in its own video. Now to move the camera around, all you have to do is right click and drag, and that will basically change where you're looking. Now while you're doing that, you can also use W, A, S, and D to move forward, back, left, and right, as well as Q and E to move up and down. So you can kind of fly through your scene here just like that. I'm actually going to increase the target frame rate so it's a little smoother. There we go. Now to move objects around, when you select an object, you'll notice we have these arrows. Now, this is called the transform gizmo, and they're basically little handles that you can use to move the object on the X, Y, and Z axis. Right now we're in move mode, but you can switch to rotate mode up here and scale mode to make the object bigger or smaller. While you're moving, you can also hold shift and click and drag anywhere on the object, and it will move on the X and Z plane, essentially kind of like on the ground of the object. Just makes it easier to place the object. And while scaling, you can also drag each individual axis, or if you hold shift, you can click and drag any axis and it will scale the entire object uniformly. And you'll see over here, as I change the object's properties, the object's transform values, they update over here accordingly. I can also set the values manually over here if I would like. So let's make this 0, 0, 0. So now the rotation is reset. At the top up here, we can also change the axis direction. So for example, we can switch between global and local, which is essentially just the way these arrows are facing. So in global mode, these arrows will always face this direction, regardless of the object's rotation. But if we switch to local mode, now the arrows will rotate along with the object. It's really useful when working with the Z and X axis. As you'll see here, sometimes it can get a little annoying if the arrows are facing this way, and so on and so forth. It really depends on what you're doing and what kind of movements you're trying to make. We can also snap the object to a grid when moving by holding down Control. So when you're holding down Control, you can just drag any one of the arrows and it will snap to a grid. You can adjust the grid by pressing the little grid button and changing these values. You can also show and hide the grid, which is a little easier to see in the dark. We can also open a little window that shows what the currently active camera is seeing. That's something we're going to show in a later video. We also have undo and redo options. These are arrows that only affect the movement of objects in the scene, not other things in the SceneForge editor. You can also do Command or Control Z and Y to basically do the exact same thing with the keyboard shortcut. You can also duplicate an object by doing Control D, and that will just create a copy right next to it. We also have the ruler tool, which is really useful for measuring distances in your scene. So for example, I'm going to set this to meters, and I can click between these 2 points and it will show me that the distance is about 3 meters. And if I switch this to feet, we can see that the height is about 46 feet. So that you can tell how big objects really are. I got a little confused there. If you click again on the corners, you'll see that the object is 6.71 feet. That makes a lot more sense. But it's useful for checking distances in your scene as well, like along the ground. To create objects, you can use the Create menu or the Library tab. So in this example, I'm going to use the Create menu, and I'm going to drag in a light. So in the lights category, we can drag in a light bulb, and you see when I drag in an object, it becomes stuck to my cursor. So we can move it around our scene. We can also use the scroll wheel to rotate it around the y-axis. This is a bad example because there's not much change happening when it rotates. And all you have to do is click, and now the object will be placed in your scene. So this is another example how different objects have different properties. So lights, you can see here, have different properties for the intensity and the color / temperature of the light. Lights are going to get their own video in the future, but this is just a good example of the different properties. And so that's basically an overview of stage mode. As you can see, with some objects that you import from the Library tab, it's really easy to create some really interesting scene layouts and designs using just these tools. Different objects properties are going to be gone over in a separate video in the future, so we can talk a little bit more in depth about what each thing does, ray trace reflections, what magic mesh optimizer is, and so on. So that's basically it. That's stage mode. In the next video, we're going to talk about shoot mode, as well as working with cameras in SceneForge. Thank you very much.